The morning air was soft and golden, drifting through the manicured hedges of the Blackstone estate. Birds chattered in the distance, their songs weaving into the stillness of a new day. But that peace shattered like glass the moment Richard Blackstone's voice cut across the garden. "Get your dirty hands off my daughter right now!" The words tore through the air sharp as a whip. He stood 10 yards away, his polished shoes gleaming, his tailored $3,000 suit immaculate against the green grass. Every detail about him screamed wealth, control, power. But his eyes, icy blue and narrowed, were fixed with fury on the sight before him. There, on the perfectly trimmed lawn where no uninvited guest had ever been allowed, sat Sophie Blackstone, his daughter, his only heir. She wasn't sitting on a bench or at the marble table where her tutors usually worked with her. No, she was cross-legged in the grass, her expensive notebook spread open, pencils scratching furiously across the page. Beside her, barefoot and with tangled hair catching the sunlight, was a girl he had never seen before. A girl who didn't belong here. The contrast was brutal. Sophie, with her spotless white dress and designer sandals, leaning in close to a girl whose clothes looked as though they had been slept in for days. This stranger had skin marked by dust, hands rough from the streets, yet there was no fear in her. Her dark eyes, steady and unreadable, lifted slowly to meet Richard's. She didn't flinch. She didn't stumble backward or scramble to her feet like every other intruder would have. She simply looked at him, brushing grass from her palms with a quiet dignity that made his rage stall for a heartbeat. Sophie turned quickly, her face pale. "Dad, wait, she's helping me." Richard ignored her. His chest rose and fell as though he'd been running. Anger coiled inside him, hot and restless. The scene didn't make sense. His daughter, the girl he paid thousands for tutors and private schools, was sitting in the dirt learning from a barefoot stranger. Security. Where was security? His mind boiled with questions as his eyes locked on the girl. Who was she? How had she gotten past gates, guards, and cameras? This was his fortress, his sanctuary, his empire. Yet here she was, as if she belonged. "You!" Richard snapped, his voice dropping low. "Dangerous. Stand up. Now!" The girl rose slowly, her movements deliberate, controlled, like someone much older than her 12 years. Her shoulders were squared, her chin slightly lifted. She didn't look like a child caught trespassing. She looked like someone who had expected this moment, as if she had been waiting for him. Sophie scrambled to her feet too, clutching her notebook to her chest. "Dad, she's not hurting me. She's explaining algebra. I finally understand the equations." "Enough!" Richard barked, his glare slicing toward his daughter before returning to the girl. "I asked you a question. Who are you, and how did you get in here?" The girl said nothing. Her silence was heavier than words, unsettling in a way that gnawed at him. She didn't tremble. She didn't beg. She didn't look ashamed. Richard took a step forward, every instinct screaming to regain control. This was his world, his rules. Yet with every second she refused to answer, he felt something foreign in his chest, a flicker of unease. Sophie's voice broke the tension, trembling but brave. "Her name's Kiara Johnson, and she's been helping me, Dad, more than anyone else ever has." The name hung in the air. Kiara. Richard repeated it in his mind as if testing it, but it only deepened the strangeness. His jaw clenched. This wasn't just disobedience. This was a challenge right here in his garden, right in front of his daughter. And the way the girl's steady gaze pierced through him, calm and unafraid, only made his pulse pound harder. Richard's voice hardened. "You don't belong here." Finally, the girl spoke. Her voice was clear, firm, and carried none of the trembling he expected. "Maybe not, but your daughter does." The words struck him like a blade. For a moment, Richard forgot the security he was about to call, forgot the fury boiling in his blood. All he could see was the fearless steadiness of a child who had nothing, yet stood before him as though she had everything. And in that moment, Richard Blackstone felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not control, but the unsettling echo of a question he couldn't silence. Who was this girl? The air in the garden still vibrated with Richard's anger, though his words had faded into silence. The security guards rushed in, confused, breathless, as if they themselves couldn't believe what they were seeing. One of them spoke nervously. "Sir, we checked the cameras. We don't know how she got through." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the shock of failure. Richard barely heard him. His eyes were locked on the barefoot girl standing there with her hands at her sides, neither begging for mercy nor offering excuses. Her face carried a calmness that unsettled him, a stillness too old for her age. It was the kind of look he had only ever seen across the boardroom table, when a rival executive already knew they had the upper hand. Sophie tugged at his sleeve, her small voice desperate. "Dad, she hasn't done anything wrong. She's been helping me. Please don't be mad." But Richard pulled his arm away, his jaw tightening. His mind screamed at the absurdity. This child, this intruder, had breached the sanctuary of his $200 million empire. His daughter's safety was non-negotiable. His voice thundered again. Helping you? Sophie, she's a stranger. Do you have any idea how dangerous this is? Sophie's lips trembled, but her eyes shone with something that he hadn't seen in her for years. Conviction. She understands me, Dad. She explains things in a way no one else does. I finally feel smart. Her words cracked, and she clutched the notebook tighter. Richard's chest tightened at the sound, but he buried it quickly under layers of practiced control. He turned back to the girl. Who sent you here? What do you want from us? His tone dripped with suspicion, sharpened by years of guarding what was his. The girl, Kiara, tilted her head slightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, as if she had measured each word. No one sent me. I don't want anything. I only wanted a quiet place to study. Your garden was the only place I could see books I couldn't touch anywhere else. Richard frowned, confused. Books? She said it so simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Yet her presence here was anything but natural. His empire had layers of protection. Nobody just walked in. He gestured to the guards. Call the police. Trespassing. The guards hesitated. They glanced at Sophie, who had stepped in front of Kiara, her arms spread like a fragile shield. Tears burned in her eyes. No, don't call the police. She's my friend. Richard's fury spiked, but beneath it, a crack of doubt widened. His daughter had called her a friend, and in Sophie's trembling voice there was something that made him falter, a rawness, a need he had ignored for too long. His gaze flicked back to Kiara. She still wasn't afraid. In fact, she met his anger with something far more unsettling, patience. It was the patience of someone who had seen worse than his rage, someone who had lived in storms far greater than a billionaire's threats. Richard's chest tightened again, but this time he couldn't shake it off. Something about this girl's presence didn't fit into the world he controlled. She wasn't just another intruder. She wasn't just another child. She was different. And though he didn't yet know why, Richard Blackstone felt the first shadow of unease crawl down his spine. The guards waited for his order, their hands twitching near their radios, but Richard hesitated. He didn't understand why. He could have ended this intrusion in seconds, yet something about the way the girl stood there, calm, collected, unshaken, kept his command trapped in his throat. Sophie clutched her notebook like it was a lifeline. Her small voice trembled, but she pushed forward anyway. Dad, please listen. She's not dangerous. She's the first person who ever made me understand math. Her words came out in a rush, like if she stopped, her courage would vanish. Richard's jaw clenched. He'd paid for the best tutors in the city, spent thousands on learning programs and specialists. Yet every report came back the same. Sophie was struggling, unfocused, falling behind. Hearing his daughter suggest that some barefoot stranger had succeeded where professionals failed felt like an insult. His pride bristled. He turned on Kiara, his voice cold. And what makes you think you're qualified to teach my daughter? You don't even belong here. You're a trespasser, and you'll be treated as one. Kiara didn't flinch. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her eyes locked on his with quiet strength. Because your daughter isn't stupid, she said simply. Her voice was steady, like a stone dropped in water. She has dyslexia. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Sophie's breath caught. Her eyes widened, her lips parting as though she'd been struck by lightning. Richard froze, his mind scrambling to process what he had just heard. Dyslexia? Kiara spoke again, calm and precise. She reverses letters and numbers when she reads. That's why equations look like puzzles that don't fit. That's why she struggles with reading aloud, but she's sharp when she listens. Any teacher paying attention would have seen it. Sophie's hands trembled around her notebook. Is that why I always mix things up? She whispered, almost to herself. Her voice cracked under the weight of sudden clarity. Richard blinked, stunned. For years, he'd watched his daughter cry silently over homework, watched her frustration grow with every failed test, every report card filled with disappointment. Tutors came and went, shaking their heads, blaming laziness, blaming distraction. And yet here, in less than 5 minutes, this girl, this homeless child, had spoken words that cracked open a truth his money had never bought. His throat tightened. How do you know that? Kiara's gaze didn't waver. Because I pay attention. She folded her arms gently across her chest. Something your tutors don't do. Something you don't do. The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard's pride screamed at him to dismiss her words, to call her a liar, to throw her off his property and end this absurd conversation. But deep inside, beneath layers of ego and wealth, he felt something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, not of shame this time, but of relief. "So I'm not dumb?" she whispered. Her voice trembled, fragile and full of hope. Kiara turned to her with the gentlest smile. "You're not dumb at all. You just learn differently, and there's nothing wrong with that." Richard's chest ached at the sight of his daughter's trembling smile, her face brightening in a way he hadn't seen since she was small. For the first time in years, Sophie looked like she believed in herself. And that, more than anything, terrified him, because it meant this strange barefoot girl had given his daughter something he never could, understanding. He turned his gaze back to Kiara, his eyes narrowing. "You're very sure of yourself for someone who doesn't even go to school." Kiara held his stare, unshaken. "Maybe that's exactly why I see what they don't." The words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He felt his control slipping, his authority fraying. And for the first time, Richard Blackstone, the man who prided himself on being unshakable, wondered if this barefoot girl was about to turn his entire world upside down. Richard's phone was already in his hand, his thumb moving with the speed of habit. Numbers and names filled the screen as he searched, his face hardening with every second. The moment Kiara's full name had slipped out, Johnson, he had everything he needed. Wealth had taught him one lesson above all: information was power, and he always knew where to find it. Within moments, the cold facts glowed on the screen. Mother, history of psychiatric hospitalizations, current address listed at a homeless shelter, no formal education after age 9. His lips twisted into a grim smile, his voice heavy with disdain. Of course, that explains everything. He lifted his gaze, eyes sharp as steel. "Do you see this, Sophie? This girl doesn't belong here. She's not some miracle tutor. She's a manipulator. People like her always have ulterior motives. They're after something, money, access, whatever they can get, and you're too naive to see it." Sophie's face crumpled, tears already welling in her eyes. "Dad, stop. She's never asked me for anything, not even food. She just wanted to help." Richard's voice dropped into the same tone he used in boardrooms when shutting down opposition. "You don't understand the world, Sophie. I built this life for you, so you wouldn't have to. And part of protecting you is keeping people like her far away." But then Kiara finally spoke, her voice steady, her words deliberate. "You're right," she said softly. "I don't belong here. I shouldn't be in your garden." Her eyes flicked to Sophie, then back to him, unwavering. "But your daughter was failing 5 subjects before I arrived. And you didn't even notice." The air seemed to freeze. Even the guards shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between their employer and the girl who had dared to challenge him. Richard's jaw tightened. "What did you just say?" Kiara straightened her shoulders, standing taller despite the dirt on her clothes, despite her bare feet on the grass. "Sophie isn't broken. She isn't lazy. She has dyslexia, and she's been drowning under the weight of people who were paid to help her but didn't care enough to see. You didn't care enough to see." Her words hit him like blows. For a moment, Richard felt the heat of shame burning beneath his skin. He wanted to push it away, wanted to bury it beneath anger. But Sophie's wide, tear-filled eyes stopped him. She was staring at Kiara as though the girl had just opened a door to a new world. Richard turned away sharply, clinging to the armor of arrogance. "Enough of this nonsense. Guards, escort her out. Now." But before the men could move, Sophie cried out, her small body stepping in front of Kiara once more. "No, you can't. She's my friend. She's the only one who listens to me." Her voice cracked, but it carried a strength Richard rarely heard from her. For a heartbeat, he froze, torn between fury and something else he couldn't name. He looked at Kiara again, and there it was, that calm, unnerving patience. She wasn't begging. She wasn't even pleading her case. She was simply waiting for him to prove her right. The arrogance in him screamed to end this, to show control. But deep inside, a question clawed at him, one he couldn't shake. Why did this barefoot girl see his daughter more clearly in 2 weeks than he had in 12 years? And in that question, for the first time, Richard felt the smallest crack in the fortress he had built around himself. Dinner that night was quiet, far too quiet for a home that large. The long dining table gleamed under crystal chandeliers, the silverware polished to perfection, but none of it mattered. Sophie pushed food around her plate without eating, her face pale and distant. Richard sat across from her, the clinking of his knife against porcelain sounding almost violent in the stillness. He tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing. He had protected his daughter, his home, his reputation. That girl had been an intruder, nothing more. Yet every time he looked at Sophie, slumped in her chair with her eyes red from crying, doubt gnawed at him. He cleared his throat, his voice softer than usual. "You'll have a new tutor by next week. Someone more experienced." Sophie didn't look up. Her fork slipped from her fingers, clattering against the plate. "She understood me," she whispered. "And you threw her away." The words pierced him sharper than any insult in a boardroom ever had. Richard's lips pressed into a line. He opened his mouth to respond, but the weight in Sophie's voice silenced him. He watched her leave the table without finishing her dinner, her small footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls until they disappeared into her room. He was left alone with his expensive meal and an ache in his chest he refused to name. Meanwhile, across the city, Kiara sat hunched over a computer in the public library. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the faint scent of old books and dust clung to the air. Around her, students flipped through textbooks, workers tapped at keyboards, but she barely noticed. Her focus was razor-sharp. She wasn't reading fairy tales or children's novels. She was deep into government records, corporate contracts, and leaked news archives. Her sharp eyes scanned every line, every paragraph, her fingers moving quickly as she scribbled notes into scraps of paper salvaged from recycling bins. And then she found it. Blackstone Corporation. The name sat bold at the top of a scanned contract. Her lips curled into the faintest smile. Richard Blackstone, the man who had dismissed her, insulted her, thrown her out like she was nothing. She leaned closer, her finger tracing the words. The documents told stories of housing projects, government-funded, massive contracts worth millions. But the deeper she dug, the darker the details became. Substandard materials, cheap construction on contaminated land, families forced to live in units that looked new on the outside but poisoned them slowly on the inside. Her heart clenched when she read the medical reports. Children with lung infections, parents filing lawsuits only to be silenced with threats. She bit down on her lip, her hands trembling not from fear but from fury. 23 children, 23 names tied to one project alone. For 2 months, she had studied the Blackstone estate, memorizing security schedules and blind spots, not to harm, but to find a place to learn. But in those same weeks, she had studied something else. Sophie. The girl who had cried over equations, who had hidden her tears in the shadows of a library window. Sophie had become more than just a friend. She was a reminder that the powerful could fail and the vulnerable could see what no one else noticed. Now Kiara realized the truth. This wasn't just about Sophie anymore. This was about every child who had been told they didn't matter, every family who had been crushed under the weight of money and power. Richard Blackstone had built his empire on arrogance and exploitation, and Kiara Johnson, barefoot, homeless, forgotten, had just stumbled onto the crack that could bring it all down. As she closed the file, her reflection caught faintly in the darkened computer screen. For a moment, and she almost didn't recognize herself. She didn't look like a lost girl anymore. She oaked like someone who had discovered her purpose. Back at the mansion, Richard poured himself a glass of scotch, trying to drown the unease that clung to him. The liquor burned his throat, but it didn't quiet his mind. He saw Sophie's face at dinner, pale with betrayal. He heard Kiara's voice, steady, fearless, as she spoke truths no one else had dared to tell him. He told himself he had ended the problem, but deep down, he felt it. The problem had only just begun. 6 weeks later, the world inside the Blackstone mansion looked polished and perfect again. The hedges were trimmed, the marble floors gleamed, and security cameras had been upgraded twice over. To any outsider, it appeared that the intruder problem was solved. Richard told himself the same story every morning as he adjusted his cufflinks and stepped into his chauffeured car. Order had been restored. But late one afternoon, as he sat in his oak-paneled office reviewing contracts, his assistant entered with a puzzled expression. "This came for you, sir. Hand-delivered. No return address." Richard raised an eyebrow. He disliked surprises. He slit the envelope open with a silver letter opener and pulled out a single piece of paper. No letterhead, no signature, just one line, typed in bold black letters. "Some lessons cost $200 million. Get ready for yours." Richard barked a laugh. It was short, harsh, and more annoyed than amused. "Empty threats," he muttered, crumpling the paper in his fist. He tossed it into the trash as if the words were beneath him. Desperate people do desperate things. But even as he tried to brush it off, the line burrowed into his mind like a splinter. He poured himself a drink, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, and told himself he'd seen this all before. Jealous rivals, bitter ex-employees, activists with too much time on their hands. They always thought they could intimidate him. And yet here he was, still standing at the top. He leaned back in his chair, smugness settling on his face. Whoever wrote that letter doesn't know who they're dealing with. Across town, in the hushed stillness of the public library, Kiara Johnson sat with Professor Janet Williams. The older woman adjusted her glasses and scanned the stack of papers Kiara had spread across the table. Leaked emails, photocopied contracts, medical reports tied to Blackstone Corporation's housing projects. Janet's brow furrowed. Do you understand what you've gathered here, Kiara? This isn't just carelessness. This is criminal negligence. Kiara's fingers traced over one report, her voice calm but firm. 23 children got sick from one project alone, and there are more. He thought no one would ever look closely. She paused, her eyes steady. But I've been watching him. Every move, every deal. He believes people like me can't fight back. That's his mistake. Janet studied her for a long moment, seeing not a child but a mind sharpened by survival. If you're serious about this, we'll need to build it carefully. Evidence, testimony, legal framing. He'll try to crush you. Kiara's lips curved into the faintest smile. He already tried. He threw me out like I was nothing. But he doesn't know I've been preparing for this since the day I saw Sophie crying alone in that garden. Back at the mansion, Richard's confidence swelled as he signed another multi-million-dollar deal. To him, the letter was nothing but the bark of a dog without teeth. He boasted to his board members later that evening, "Some little nobody thinks they can rattle me. Let them try. I've buried bigger threats than this." But in the quiet hours of the night, when the mansion was still and even his own reflection in the glass seemed to mock him, he couldn't stop the line from repeating in his head. So, me lessons cost $200 million. For a man who had built his empire on arrogance, the idea of a lesson he couldn't buy his way out of was unthinkable. And yet, somewhere in the city, a barefoot girl with nothing but scraps of paper and a burning mind was already sharpening the blade of truth that would cut straight through his empire. The decision was made in less than a minute, as if Richard were closing another deal. He sat at the breakfast table sipping his coffee while Sophie pushed her cereal around with a spoon, barely eating. She hadn't been the same since Kiara was forced out. Her laughter had gone quiet, her questions fewer. She seemed smaller somehow, weighed down by something invisible. Richard watched her, a knot of frustration tightening in his chest. He told himself it wasn't his fault. She was just too easily influenced, too fragile for her own good. He needed to step in, to act decisively. That's what he always did in business, and it always worked. He folded his newspaper with crisp precision. "Sophie," he said, his tone firm but carefully measured, "you'll be starting at Crestwood Academy next month. It's a boarding school in Boston, one of the best in the country. You'll be away from distractions." The spoon fell from her hand and clattered into the bowl, splashing milk onto the tablecloth. "Boston?" she whispered. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You're sending me away?" Richard's jaw tightened. "It's for your own good. You need to focus. Crestwood has specialists who will help you with your studies. Friends from your own circle. You'll be better off there." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she shook her head fiercely. "No, this isn't about me. It's about her. You're doing this because of Kiara." Her voice cracked on the name, echoing off the tall dining room walls. Richard flinched, though he masked it quickly with coldness. "That girl was never supposed to be here. She doesn't belong in your life. This is the only way to move forward." Sophie shoved back her chair, her small fists clenched. "You don't understand. She believed in me. She made me feel like I wasn't broken. And you're taking that away." Her tears fell freely now, staining her cheeks. "I'll hate you for this." The words sliced deeper than he expected. He froze, coffee cup halfway to his lips, staring at his daughter as if she'd just struck him. Hate. She had never spoken to him like that. He tried to summon anger, but what he felt instead was something far worse, an emptiness he didn't know how to name. That night, when Sophie was supposed to be asleep, she curled beneath her blankets with her phone hidden under her pillow. Her hands shook as she dialed the number she had memorized weeks ago, a number written in tiny letters on the corner of her notebook. "Hello?" Kiara's voice came softly through the crackling line. Sophie's breath hitched. "It's me, Sophie. My dad, he's sending me away, to Boston. He says it's your fault." Her words tumbled out in a whisper between sobs. There was a pause on the other end, then Kiara's voice, calm and steady as always. "It's not your fault, Sophie, and it's not really mine either. Your father thinks distance will solve what he doesn't want to face." Sophie sniffled. What are we going to do? We're not going to do anything, Kiara said gently. You're going to Boston. You're going to study hard, make friends, and prove to everyone, including your dad, that you're smarter than they ever thought. And me? Her voice grew firmer. I'll take care of the rest. The rest? Sophie whispered. Kiara looked across the library table at the growing pile of evidence beside her. Contracts, emails, photographs, pieces of a puzzle that pointed straight at Richard Blackstone's empire. Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Your father thinks he's untouchable, she said softly. But every empire has cracks, and sometimes it takes someone with nothing to lose to find them. Sophie closed her eyes, clutching the phone tight against her ear. For the first time since her father's announcement, she felt a flicker of hope. Back in his office, Richard leaned against his desk, staring out at the city skyline. Boston was booked. Arrangements were in motion. He told himself he had won, that he had cut the root of the problem clean. But as the city lights blurred into the night, that single line from the anonymous letter echoed in his mind again. Some lessons cost $200 million. And though he would never admit it, for the first time in a very long time, Richard Blackstone felt afraid. The morning began like any other, with Richard Blackstone reviewing contracts in his glass-walled office high above the city. The skyline stretched endlessly, a kingdom he believed was his alone. He had silenced competitors, bought loyalty, buried scandals. Crestwood Academy had already sent confirmation that Sophie's admission was secured. The problem, he thought smugly, was solved. But at 10:15 a.m., the first crack appeared. His assistant, pale and trembling, rushed into the office without knocking. Sir, you need to see this. She held out the remote with shaking hands. Richard frowned, irritation rising. He hated interruptions. But when the screen on the wall flickered to life, his world shifted. On CNN, a reporter stood in front of a children's hospital, a thick folder clutched in her hands. The chyron blared across the screen in red. Exclusive, Blackstone Corporation accused of endangering families. Richard's stomach dropped. The reporter's voice was sharp, deliberate. Documents obtained by our station reveal that Blackstone Corporation knowingly built low-income housing on contaminated land. 3 children developed severe respiratory illnesses, yet the company covered up the evidence, silenced families through intimidation, and bribed officials to avoid lawsuits. Photographs filled the screen. Kids in hospital beds, their faces pale, oxygen tubes at their noses, mothers sobbing into microphones, doctors pointing to charts and medical records. Then came something worse, copies of contracts, emails with his executives, internal memos stamped with his own signature. Richard's hand tightened around his glass of water until it nearly shattered. Turn it off, he snapped. But the television stayed on, his assistant frozen in shock. Most shocking, the reporter continued, are recordings in which CEO Richard Blackstone refers to these families as an acceptable statistical loss. These words, from the man responsible for hundreds of millions in government housing contracts, are sparking outrage across the country. The clip played. His own voice, cold and dismissive, echoed through the office. If they can't afford better lawyers, that's not our problem. Richard staggered back against his desk, color draining from his face. No, this isn't possible. Those files were sealed, those recordings. The phone on his desk rang, then another, then another. His email pinged relentlessly, a flood of subject lines. Urgent, press request, SEC investigation inquiry, board emergency meeting. And then the sound came from the street below. His assistant pulled back the blinds, revealing a sea of reporters gathered at the building entrance, microphones raised, cameras flashing. Headlines were already trending online. Hashtag Blackstone corruption soared across social media, millions of posts spreading in minutes. Richard's breath came shallow. Who did this? He whispered. Who got this? The answer arrived in the form of a phone call. His private cell buzzed, the screen, Shoto, wing an unknown number. With trembling fingers, he answered. Hello? Hello, Mr. Blackstone. The voice was calm, steady, unmistakable. A child's voice, yet sharper than any blade. Remember me? His grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. You. Kiara's voice was almost gentle. The girl you called a trespasser. The one you said didn't belong. Richard's knees nearly buckled. How did you? The same way I solved Sophie's math problems, Kiara replied. By paying attention, by seeing what you thought no one would notice. I watched, I listened, I learned, and while you laughed at a warning, I was building a case. Richard's eyes darted to the television, where footage of FBI vans arriving outside another Blackstone property filled the screen. Agents in jackets carried boxes, evidence bags, hard drives. His empire was being raided in real time. Kiara's voice grew sharper. You built your fortune on the backs of families who couldn't fight back. You called their suffering acceptable. But you forgot something, Mr. Blackstone. Some of us may be barefoot, but we're not blind. The line went silent for a moment, just long enough for his chest to seize with fear. Then her voice returned, softer, cutting him deeper than anger ever could. Your daughter believed me when I told her she wasn't broken. Too bad you never did. The call ended. Richard stood frozen in the center of his office, the walls closing in, the sound of his own downfall echoing through every screen, every headline, every phone call. For the first time in his life, the billionaire who had always been untouchable realized the truth. His empire was crumbling, and it had all begun with a barefoot girl who refused to be ignored. The phones wouldn't stop ringing. His office felt smaller by the second, the walls closing in as headlines screamed his name. Richard Blackstone, once a man who controlled boardrooms with a glance, now stood with sweat beading on his forehead, his heart pounding like a drum he couldn't silence. And then his private line buzzed again. He almost ignored it, but something in his gut told him to answer. Slowly, with hands that trembled against his will, he pressed the phone to his ear. Mr. Blackstone, came the voice. Calm, steady, too steady. His throat tightened. Kiara. He spat her name like poison. She didn't flinch. He could hear it in her voice, that same unsettling patience. You sound different now. Not as confident as the man who told me people like me always have ulterior motives. Richard's jaw clenched. He forced steel into his tone, though it cracked at the edges. What do you want from me? Money? Is that what this is about? I'll pay you. 2 million. 5. Name your price. Kiara laughed, not a cruel laugh, but the light, almost innocent laugh of a child. The sound cut him deeper than rage ever could. You still don't understand. I don't want your money. I want justice. For the children who can't breathe because of your buildings. For the families you silenced with threats. For Sophie. Her name landed like a blow. Richard's heart skipped. Sophie has nothing to do with this. Doesn't she? Kiara's tone sharpened. Every afternoon I saw her crying alone in that garden while you came home too late to notice. She begged for someone to see her, to listen. I did. You didn't. You were too busy protecting an empire built on lies. Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to shout to cut her off, but her words burrowed into him like nails. He remembered Sophie's trembling voice at the dining table, the way she had shielded Kiara with her small body, her declaration, I'll hate you for this. You're out of line, he whispered, his voice breaking. You're just a child. And yet here I am, Kiara replied softly, bringing down everything you built. Maybe it isn't me who's out of line. Maybe it's you. Richard pressed his palm against his desk to steady himself, his knees threatening to give out. Through the glass walls of his office, he saw chaos, employees whispering, executives on frantic phone calls, agents pushing through the lobby below. His world was unraveling in real time. On the line, Kiara's voice lowered, gentle now, but laced with iron. You should know something, Mr. Blackstone. Sophie is smarter than you think. She isn't broken. She isn't lazy. She just needed someone to believe in her. She needed her father. His breath caught. Shame, heavy and suffocating, pressed against his chest. For the first time, he had no words, no rebuttal, no mask of arrogance to hide behind. Kiara let the silence hang before delivering the final cut. I may be barefoot, Mr. Blackstone. I may be homeless, but I will never let children cry alone when I can do something about it. Can you say the same? The line went dead. Richard dropped the phone onto the desk, his hand shaking. His reflection in the glass no longer looked like the man who had once believed himself invincible. It looked like a man cornered, stripped of power, left with nothing but the truth he had spent his life avoiding. For the first time in decades, Richard Blackstone wasn't the hunter. He was the prey. The Blackstone mansion stood hollow and silent, its marble floors stripped of warmth, its chandeliers dimmed for the last time. The empire it symbolized had already collapsed, sold piece by piece to pay settlements and mounting legal debts. Richard Blackstone now lived in a modest apartment far from the estate's manicured gardens, where Sophie once sat crying over math problems he had been too busy to notice. His name, once spoken with awe in financial circles, had become a punchline on late-night television. His company's stock had crumbled, his board abandoned him, and the friends who once toasted him in private clubs no longer answered his calls. But on this quiet morning, for the first time in years, Richard sat at a kitchen table not as a CEO, but as a father. Sophie sat across from him, her hair pulled back, a tablet in her hands. Her eyes, still bright but older now, carried a steadiness he didn't recognize. "Dad," she said softly, sliding the tablet across to him. "Look." Richard squinted at the screen. The headline nearly stole his breath. Harvard awards full scholarship to former homeless girl Kiara Johnson, future social justice lawyer. Beneath the words was a photo, Kiara standing at a podium, her hair neatly tied, wearing a simple dress. Behind her stood professors, community leaders, and children from shelters, applauding. Her smile was quiet, calm, the same patience that once unnerved him in his garden, now shining with purpose. Richard's chest tightened. For a moment, shame threatened to crush him. This was the girl he had called an intruder, a manipulator, a trespasser. The girl he had dismissed as nothing, and here she was, celebrated by the world as everything. Sophie's voice pulled him back. "She's going to specialize in social justice law for kids like me." Her eyes brimmed with tears, but they were proud tears. "Dad, she's going to change the world." Richard swallowed hard, his throat raw. He looked down at his hands, once steady in boardrooms, now trembling against the wood of the table. "She already did," he whispered. Sophie studied him, waiting. For years, she had begged for his attention, his belief, and been met with silence. Now, for the first time, she saw cracks in his armor. He wasn't the untouchable billionaire anymore. He was just her father. That afternoon, Richard sat alone at the small desk in his apartment, pen in hand. He hadn't written a letter in years. His words were usually typed by assistants, delivered through ours. Lawyers, polished for effect, but this had to be different. His handwriting was uneven, shaky, but each word carried weight. "Kiara, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I want to thank you. You showed me who I really was. Arrogant, blind, and unworthy of the trust my daughter gave me. You taught me what my money never could. That true power isn't control, it's presence. Sophie is proud of you. She always will be. And I should have been proud too. May you keep changing the world as you changed ours." Richard Blackstone. When he sealed the envelope, he felt something he hadn't in years: humility. 2 months later, Richard sat in front of a television again, but this time, it wasn't to watch his empire unravel. It was to watch history being made. On the screen, Kiara stood beside lawmakers as a new bill was signed into law: free access to educational resources for homeless children. The name scrolled across the bottom of the screen: the Sophie Blackstone Act. Sophie gasped, covering her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Richard reached out, hesitant at first, then placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. As cameras flashed and applause roared from the screen, Richard realized something profound. He had lost everything money could buy, but in return he had gained what he never knew he needed: a daughter who still stood by him, and a lesson from a barefoot girl who had taught him the true meaning of wealth. For the first time in years, Richard Blackstone smiled, not with arrogance, but with gratitude, because in losing his empire, he had found his humanity. And somewhere, he hoped Kiara Johnson knew that her greatest victory wasn't destroying a billionaire's fortune, it was rewriting what it meant to truly matter.